Going to go into managing for pasture quality and targeted animal performance. And I actually used to call this presentation um, grazing management for high animal performance. And then I realized we're not always looking for high animal performance. Sometimes we're just looking for adequate or appropriate animal performance. I mean, what kind of high performance are we trying to get out of a non-lactating mid-gestation cow? I'm not looking for high performance there. I'm looking for something a little better than survival, but definitely not high performance. Okay, so we already talked about what is poor pasture, and said somebody created that. They made that poor pasture, and we described excellent pasture. We got that high in energy, adequate in protein, mineral rich, so on. It said again, this doesn't happen by accident. Somebody has to make the management choices to create it. All right. We talked through the management objectives and management strategies. Now we're going to take management strategies and tailor it more pointedly towards managing animal nutrition. Livestock's got to harvest that excellent pasture. Okay. And because I already expressed that it is the energy content of the forage that we're really concerned with, because it's energy availability that drives performance. Need to understand some basic things about energy. When we have breeding females, they have 4 production functions, well, maintenance and 3 production functions, but there's 4 metabolic functions to which they need energy, and they allocate energy in a priority order. And maintenance is always the first priority. Maintenance is being able to stand up, breathe, poop and pee, eat, and just be a cow, be you. That's maintenance. And there's a certain percent of the animal's body weight that we need that much weight of feed to support maintenance. When we look at a beef cow, well, there's the science, there's the lab science. NRC, National Research Council. Often when we talk about animal nutrition, someone will reference, well, the NRC says. NRC says that the basal maintenance requirement of a beef cow is 1.4% of body weight feed consumption. Well, if you are in a controlled environment and the animal isn't walking around, isn't having to adjust metabolism for it being too cold or being too hot, and the feed is of the perfect diet quality, and it's just ad lib in front of them, 1.4% is about what maintenance requirement is. Out in the real world of climbing up and down the hills, having to go get a drink, doing this, doing that, we actually compute in the field maintenance to be 1.9%. So it's substantially higher than what NRC says. If you feed according to NRC standards, you'll almost always be disappointed in the performance that you see, because it doesn't bring into account real world realities of what is happening every day in the life of a cow or whoever we're talking about. After maintenance is growth. An animal does want to get to its mature weight, before it's old and feeding. So growth is the next priority. And then we have lactation. Now, some animals lactate heavily and they lose weight. Well, that makes it sound like lactation is a higher priority than what growth is. On any given day, the animal's responding to different, cues and signals, and so you might get different outcomes. But growth and lactation are production traits that have requirements beyond maintenance. And then the last one is reproduction. A female has to have adequate energy in the body to come back into estrus and cycle and be able to get bred again. But it is the lowest priority, is reproduction. So that's how breeding females allocate energy: maintenance, growth, lactation, reproduction. If we look at growing and finishing animals, guess what? First priority is maintenance, second one is growth. Now, because these animals do not have a lactation demand, they get excess energy and they start creating fat. And there are the extra muscular fat, which in cattle we would and sheep we'd most commonly be referring to as back fat. And then you have intramuscular fat or marbling. And back fat is, energy for back fat is allocated before energy to marbling. We have to have excess energy beyond maintenance, growth, and back fat deposition to have marbling occur. So that's the priority in which growing and finishing animals allocate energy. We can look at the forage we have available and classify it based on energy content. And very often the expression of energy we use is total digestible nutrients, or TDN. And the higher the TDN number is, the greater the amount of digestible energy available in that forage. So we can look at animals that have what we would consider to be a very high energy requirement. So they need to have feed with a TDN greater than 68%. Lactating dairy animals, ewes and nannies nursing twins and triplets, and then finishing beef animals. So the only animal in the beef production sector that has a very high energy requirement is finishing. And that is because we need energy, excess energy in the body, energy beyond 68% TDN to have marbling occur. So to get good, high quality finish grade, we need to have marble just like in the feedlot. Our goal these days for grass-fed beef is to have the majority of the animals finish as USDA choice. 10 years ago, our target was high select to low choice, because I don't know if you've heard anyone say this lately, but the war on fat is over and fat won. So people aren't afraid to eat fatty beef anymore. The percentage, the consumer demand for beef has been increasing, and it is increasing most rapidly in the high choice and prime grades. Most consumers actually want well-fatted beef. And so if we want to meet what the consumer is looking for today, when grass-fed beef was really starting to emerge on the scene in the 1990s and early 2000s, one of the selling points was it's leaner, it's lower fat content, it's less cholesterol than the feedlot beef. But everybody wants, high cholesterol, high fat beef. So if you want to be successful in the grass-fed beef business these days, you better be able to get animals to marble. High energy, so this would be TDNs ranging from 60 to 68%. I guess actually I should say 67.9%, but it is so easy to write 68. Lactating beef cows, they don't have to have as much energy as a dairy cow because they're not producing as much milk. Finishing lambs. Wait, what? We can finish lambs? We don't have to have very high energy to finish lambs. We can do it on high energy. Why would that be? Do we have any sheep producers? Yeah, we got a couple. This one guy, he's real hesitant to admit it.
We're just starting.
Oh, you're just starting. Okay. All right. Do any of you eat lamb? Oh, yeah. Do you care whether your lamb chop has marbling in it?
No, I don't think so, but.
No.
There's a difference between the wool lamb and the hair.
Here's-
My experience is the wool lamb is it's no problem getting fat on. The wool lamb that I butcher, they were just excess fat.
To get them fat? Yeah. But you can kill a lamb at anything from 40 pounds to 140 pounds, and it's still good. Marbling is essential to the quality eating experience of beef. Marbling is irrelevant in the lamb. And so we can finish lambs just on high energy. We don't have to have excessive amount of energy to get marbling to take place in a lamb. So we can, if you have a farm that can produce, high energy feed, but it's really difficult for you to do really very high energy, keeping feed consistently above 68% TDN, you ought to be in the sheep business, not the cattle business. And then we have growing stockers greater than 2 pounds a day. Moderate energy requirements, 54 to 60% TDN, late lactation beef cows, replacement heifers and ewe lambs. A replacement heifer doesn't need to be gaining 2 pounds a day. Pound and a quarter is generally what we're shooting for in growing replacement heifers out, or bred heifers in this case. And then stockers gaining 1 to 2 pounds a day. Well, guess what? If you want to be closer to that 2 pounds a day, you better be closer to 60% TDN. If 1.1% or pounds per day is all you need, you can be down towards that, 54%. But it is energy that's going to determine what that rate of gain is. And then the low energy group, mature livestock, typically dry females, and then mature bulls, or roughing stockers through at a low rate of gain. That's the 50 to 54% TDN. Now, there's no class of livestock we have that'll get by on less than 50% TDN in the diet. And I think tomorrow, when we talk about winter grazing, we'll get into that. So if we think about factors that drive animal performance, the first one is simply forage intake, because the more you eat, the fatter you get. That's absolutely true with livestock. There's also that, well, what is it? That's a consideration. And with people, I think it's more the consideration of what is it that you eat than simply the volume of what you eat. But on ruminant livestock, out on pasture, basically this is what it is. The more bites we can get into that animal every day, the higher the performance rate's going to be. There are 3 components of grazing that determine what the intake is going to be: the time spent grazing, the biting rate, and the size of the bite. We're going to go through these. So cattle typically spend 5 to 10 hours a day grazing. The better the volume of the forage and the quality of the forage, the fewer hours they need to graze. The lower the quality of the forage, the lower the volume of availability, the more hours they will graze. But there is a maximum amount of time ruminant animal can spend grazing, because they have to spend time ruminating, and because both grazing and ruminating are energy demanding activities, they also have to have rest. Sometimes you'll hear people say that, cows are unionized, they graze 8 hours, ruminate 8 hours, rest 8 hours. It is not split that, precisely, but it's in the right ballpark. 5 to 10 hours of grazing. If they have really good pasture conditions, so the height is right, the digestibility of the feed is good, they'll meet their intake needs in as little as 5 hours, and 15,000 bites is about what they will take. When we get into a situation like this of short pasture, and we also need to think about the mechanics of grazing. So the way that cattle graze most effectively is when they can extend their tongue, sweep a wad of forage to their mouth, and then they just, share it across between the teeth and the dental pad. So it's when they flip the tongue out and pull forage through their mouth. That's where they do the best. When they are on pasture of a height like this, and we're actually asking them to eat more like a sheep or a horse, of biting straight down where they cannot effectively use their tongue, their intake, they'll take a lot more bites, up to 45,000 in a day, but the volume of those 45,000 little sheep bites is never going to match the volume of what 15,000 tongues wheat bites will get you. So we can't ask a cow to be on a pasture like that and I'll just graze another 5 hours and you'll be okay. They can't do it. And now that's super high quality there. But what if this was dried up grass and it was only that tall because it's a drought and it's not easy to graze? Then they're going to suffer, from that standpoint also. We can go all the way out to a situation like this, where the forage quality is low enough that the cows, there's not enough hours in the day for them to eat the feed, ruminate, process the feed, and get the energy out of it. And if they can't get that accomplished, from the time they take a bite to where it's fully digested in less than, say, 72 hours, they're not going to live very long. So they have to have the flow through. Ideal pasture conditions, sheep will graze 6 to 8 hours at 40,000 bites. Sheep's mouths move a lot faster than cows do. Now, you can get into poorer pasture conditions with a sheep, and they'll extend their grazing hours substantially. Now, remember that a sheep or a goat select a high quality diet to begin with because they got a small mouth. They have, the prehensile lips where they can bite a single leaf from between the thorns on a bush. And so they select a very high quality diet. Because they select the high quality diet to begin with, they don't have to ruminate as long as what a bovine does. And so they have the flexibility to go out to, 14, 15, 16 hours of grazing, still have time to ruminate and get by. Horses can literally graze in excess of 20 hours a day, pretty well just nonstop. And that's because they are not ruminants. They're what's called a hind gut fermenter. And so ruminants is kind of a batch processing feeding system. Hind gut fermenters are a flow through feeding system. And so low quality feed is not resident in a horse for very long. To an extent, they can pass it through largely undigested just to get it out of the path and allow them to eat more. And so this is why horses are the most degrading animal on rangeland and pasture that there is, because they're almost nonstop eaters. I sometimes say that a horse can graze to 1.5 inches below the soil surface, still meet its needs. All right, so the number of hours that they can graze is largely controlled by their physiology. The biting rate does adjust to the forage conditions, but they cannot make, an extra 20,000 tiny bites make up for the big bites that they're not getting. So in managing intake and hence the performance of our animals, of those three factors, what it comes down to is bite size. is what we can control and manage for. And what we know from research we did, and research over the last century basically, bovine maximize their intake when the grass is between about 5 and 15 inches. And that's where they most effectively use their tongue to sweep forage into their mouth. All right, so I think even your neighbors can recognize when a pasture's ready to start grazing. They can look at that and say, oh yeah, that's good, that's where it needs to be. And so if we look at hundreds upon hundreds of grazing events, and if we were to have measured the forage intake of those animals across those grazing events, we would find, because we did that, and we did find that what we would call the pre-grazing herbage mass of forage height, the way the pasture is at the beginning of the grazing period, has about 23% control on what the overall intake off of that pasture is. So what's there when you start? It's only 23% of the variation in intake is determined by that. 82% of the variation in intake is based on what is left behind. Most of your neighbors don't know when they should get the cattle off the pasture. They know when it's good to put them in, but most of them don't know when to take them off. And generally, particularly grazing yearlings, disappointing performance, from my interaction with people over the years, going out and troubleshooting, why aren't your cattle doing better than what they are? You were expecting 2 pounds a day and you got 1.3. Most of the time it's simply they graze pastures too short. They stay too long. When you finally figure out that you're running out of grass, the cattle have known it for a long time already. And very often I get asked, why doesn't that add up to 100%? The reason it doesn't add up to 100% is because these are two different statistical analyses. If we had done something called stepwise regression or stepwise modeling, then all of these factors add up to 100%. But in this kind of analysis, they're not going to add up to 100%. What this actually means, again, 23% of the variation we see in intake across all of these grazing events is attributable to what the pasture was like when you went in. 82% of the variation can be explained by the condition of the pasture when you came out of it. The easiest way to increase forage intake and hence individual animal performance is you reduce your utilization rate. The lower the volume of the standing feed that you ask the animal to eat on that day, the better its performance is going to be. In looking at, we did a lot of research when I was in Missouri, and that's obviously not Missouri, but we did a lot of research on that involved measuring forage intake of animals out on pasture. And these are going to be some of our conclusions. On cool season pastures, 75% of the effect on intake is simply availability. It's just the size of the bite. How big a bite can they take? Only 25% of it's related to what is the quality of that forage that they're consuming. When we get into warm season grasses, it's a 50-50 deal. And if we come back to the cool seasons, I think I said earlier that cool season grasses are rarely ever protein deficient. So we have no limitation on rumen digestion because we have inadequate protein available for the microbes. On warm season grasses, especially as we get towards maturity, and pretty well always when we go into the dormant season, they are going to be protein deficient. And so that limits the amount of energy that the rumen microbes can pull out of the forage. So we need to be paying equal attention to the maturity stage and the quality of that forage as we do the volume. It's a lot easier to have a performance crash on warm season grasses than it is on cool season grasses. And that's because we will, at some point in this maturation process on a warm season grass, we are going to get into a protein deficiency. We go out on native range, and now I'm talking big landscape range. So Circle Pie Ranch that we were on there in Idaho for all those years, we managed one unit of, a much larger ranch. But their largest public land grazing permit area was 135,000 acres. There were 13 pastures up there. The biggest pasture was 23,000 acres. The littlest pasture was 5,000 acres. So if you have 500 cows that are going out on 23,000 acres in August, they better know where to go on that piece of real estate, to find the best bite of feed that's out there. And so that's what this foraging skill is. How well do they know the landscape, the plant community, all of that? So this one here, guy at Cornell University did this research back in the either late 80s or early 90s. And so we have forage availability across the bottom here, and then relative intake. 100% on this scale is what we call the physical distension limit of the rumen. What that means is how much can the rumen stretch and stuff more feed in. And so 100% of intake means the rumen has been stretched out to its maximum capacity. We do not very often graze at that level of intake. So we have cattle and sheep here, and we look at cattle, and somewhere basically to get that maximum intake, so the full distension of the rumen, we have to have at least a ton of feed standing in the field in front of the animals. Now that doesn't mean that there needs to be a ton when they start grazing. It means if you want to maintain that level of intake, there has to be a ton of feed when they leave the field. And in a productive environment east of here, that's not that hard to do. But certainly as dislocation and moving west from here, it becomes increasingly difficult to have that much feed in the field at the end of a grazing event. So once we get to below that extension of the rumen limit, we see intake gradually going down, and it's across a fairly broad range of forage availability, about 1,000 pounds to 2,000 pounds. But once we drop below the say 800 pounds availability, intake falls off very, very quickly, because we're to that point. If 800 pounds or less forage is what we have, the cow can't use her tongue to bring forage into the mouth. She's biting down like this, and so it's a limited intake situation. Sheep, because of their mechanics of grazing are so different from cattle, they can go to a much lower level of forage availability and still maximize intake. And again, this comes back to why a cow can thrive in places where, why a sheep can thrive where a cow will die. And you look at some of the grazing permits out west that were exclusively sheep permits, and you look at it and say, man, I don't think a cow can walk far enough in a day to get a bite. And that's exactly why they're sheep permits and not cattle permits. For the most part, we graze in this area largely by default, not because people think about this relationship on a daily basis. They just realize that to run the number of animals I need to pay the bills, I got to get this level of performance. And so we end up, this is the area 800 to about 1,600 pounds availability. That's where a lot of people end up grazing. And very often they're not real happy with their individual animal performance. But if they try to increase intake by reducing numbers, they just don't generate enough total revenue to pay the bills. So you end up finding that balance point for your own ranch, and that's where you operate. And like I said, it mostly, it isn't because people think about this. It's just over time they figure out where that sweet spot is, where we need to be stocking to get the results that we need to have. This is work that we did in Missouri, and it's looking at over a 1 week long grazing period, what the actual measured forage intake of these animals were from the first day on a new pasture till the day that they leave that pasture. And it's expressed as a percent of body weight over there. And this is one of those graphs that I don't know where's the best place to start on this. You might think, well, let's start on day one. So let's start on day one. And we have just put animals into a new pasture. And lo and behold, they're eating 4% of their body weight every day. Now, I had colleagues in ruminant nutrition who told me that's impossible. No beef animal can eat that much. Okay, but we've measured this multiple times that they're eating that much. But on the next day, they're eating less. Why do these things happen? And this is when I have to jump over here to the end of the grazing period. This red line here at 1.9%, that's maintenance. So the last 3 days, these cows were on this pasture, they were basically eating at maintenance. So the rumen has emptied out. There's not any backed up forage in there. So we put them on a new pasture, and it's this tall, and it's good feed. And yeah, they just binge feed that first day, refill the rumen, and it was over 4% of body weight. You know, if we had a steer eating 4% of body weight, what its average daily gain would be? About 8 pounds a day. And we know that doesn't happen. So that's why, for the most part, we don't believe you can have 4% of body weight intake. But if the rumen is empty because you've been half starving for 3 days, you can eat a lot. But the next day you're going to eat less because you've filled the rumen back up, but also there's less available forage to choose from. And the highest quality bites were probably already taken out, so it's going to go down. So we have binge feeding up here, moderate intake here, starvation out here. I look at that graph, and it suggests to me that I should move them after 3 days. Because after 3 days, they're still above this maintenance line, and those are good numbers. So if I move them every 3 days instead of every 7 days, I don't go into this couple days of starvation mode. Now, the 3 days, they don't eat that much on the first day because the rumen wasn't emptied out. On a 3-day rotation, they're actually going to look like these 3 bars right here. And so when we come out, we're still gaining something here because we're above maintenance. They don't eat 4% of their body weight because they weren't emptied out for X number of days. And so that's what the move them every 3 days looks like. If we move them every day, they're going to look something like this one right here, just day after day repeating that. So, this tells you something about if you're looking for higher individual performance, move them more frequently, and you should get that. As long as you're leaving adequate residual, that would be this one, as long as you're leaving adequate residual behind. This one here, same study, looking at the same data, but from a little different angle. This is looking at how much residual forage do we need to leave behind, that's the residual forage, to ensure that we maintain at least 2.5% of body weight intake. So that's a moderate level of performance. over the course of a week. How much residual do we need to leave behind? So all of these pastures are starting from about 3,400 to 3,600 pounds of dry matter. And we're looking at, okay, if we move them every day, we can actually harvest over 2/3 of that forage. All we have to leave behind is about 1,100 pound residual, and we can maintain that moderate level of performance. However, if we move them once a week, we actually have to leave about 2,400 pounds of forage behind to ensure that we keep that level of performance. Here, to get that level of performance, we can only use 1/3 of the forage. We have to leave 2/3 of it behind. So what does that tell you about how many animals you can run on a particular property if you're moving them every day versus if you're moving them once a week? If you can use 2/3 of the forage here, but only 1/3 here, just from a raw standpoint, if you can harvest in each grazing event 2,400 pounds of forage versus 1,200 pounds of forage, that says you can run twice as many animals if you're moving them every day, grazing at that 67% utilization. You don't generally go from here to here, double your stocking rate, because in general, we're not wanting to graze at 2/3. That's what you brought up about, I thought you weren't supposed to graze more than 50%. There was a time in my life I thought that too, but I got over it. I wrote an article a couple of years ago on Stockman Grass Farmer, and maybe it's just been in the last year, that was called Take Half, Leave Half, No More. All right. So when I was in Missouri, in that high rainfall environment, I was very much a take half, leave half adherent. Because when I had grazed off 2/3 or 70% or 3/4 or something, it didn't come back. Now, in the spring of the year, if it was raining every few days, you could graze like that, and yeah, it'd come back decently. But you get past, the 4th of July, and you grazed anything beyond 50%, it just didn't recover very well at all. And so that made me a pretty strong take half, leave half adherent. Now, there was one study that we did where in that study, our objective was 50% utilization. But when I looked at what our temporal utilization, and there's two different utilization rates, temporal and seasonal. They're two different things. And I think we'll probably explain that later on. But our objective was 50% utilization, and analyzing, I think it was the first 3 years of the study, our average temporal utilization was just 42%. So we were basing our target on our visual assessment of, okay, we've got about 50% of it. So we'd take the animals off, and then we would measure the residual forage and know what the utilization actually was. And as I said, what we visually were trying to do at 50%, actually we were only using 42%. So we were quite conservative. All right. So when I moved out west, because take half, leave half really started as a kind of a rangeland guideline, I thought that 50% utilization was appropriate for any kind of range situation. And what I found after living and grazing in the West on our rangeland was that 50% was way overuse on a lot of our rangeland. Because if your total production for the year is only 500 pounds, taking off half of that only leaves 250 pounds of biomass behind, and you will never build a healthier soil. You will never improve the water cycle at that degree of utilization. And so we actually use a sliding scale now that's based on what the annual forage production is. And our lowest benchmark, which is under 500 pounds forage utilization or forage production, our maximum allowable utilization is 25%, which is only 125 pounds. That's 4 animal unit days, basically. You know, that's all we're willing to take off of it, because anything else is overuse. And so when you brought up the 50% utilization, I knew I was going to come to this point here. So even though this says we could utilize 67% of it and get the same level of animal performance, the truth of the matter is we would do that at the expense of our long-term pasture or range health. And so we're not going to double the number of animals we're carrying just because we went to a daily move, because we want to pull this utilization rate, you know, back up to about here. So maybe it's a 60% increase that we're going to move towards, you know, over the course of a few years to get there, because we don't want to graze consistently at that point unless we're irrigating. See, that's the other direction I went away from take half, leave half, is on irrigated pasture, where I know I'm going to make it rain within 3 days of any grazing event. I found myself over time, because when I first started there, I was trying to stick to 50% utilization, and then, well, I went to 52, 56, 60, and I'm actually, for the type of mixed pasture that we have under those pivots, I'm very comfortable, you know, doing a 2/3, 1/3 grazing. Every time I come in there, I can take 2/3 of that off, because we grow so much feed, leaving 1/3 behind is still probably 1,400 pounds plus or minus. And so we have a strong regrowth base from that right there. So no, I am not a take half, leave half guy anymore. I am totally in it depends. There is an appropriate level of utilization, and that depends on the environment you're in and there. Is there such a thing as leaving too much? Yeah, but if you're leaving too much, it's probably because maybe you're only grazing off 20, 30% of the pasture each time. And what you get from too low a utilization rate is you are setting up the opportunity for the animals to selectively graze only the most desirable plants out of there. You're not putting any pressure on the less desirable plants. And so our most desirables tend to fade away, our least desirables tend to increase. So that's one product of underutilization. If you have components of the pasture, and this would typically be forbs or legumes, that require natural reseeding, if you have too much plant material left out there, it makes natural reseeding very difficult. Two aspects of it: seeds ever actually getting in contact with the soil, because there's too much plant material there. And then the other one is just always too much shade for seedlings to get sunlight. And then there are some plants that just start to die back if they're not properly grazed. And very often the way you see that is, you know, it'll be in bunch grasses, and the center of the bunch starts dying, and you end up, you know, with a ring of living grass and a dead center. That's the product of underutilization. So there definitely is an issue with too low a utilization rate. Now, the too high of a utilization rate generally gives us more problems, you know, if we consistently are overutilizing, but underutilizing has its problems also. I think we've seen these pictures again. To me, this is a good starting point, you know, for grazing. This is what I describe as high phase 2. So it's still primarily vegetative grass. There's a few grasses headed out, but it's not, a whole field of seed heads. So in this particular pasture where I took these pictures, I measured it and it was 14 inches tall, and I estimated it was about 3,400 pounds of dry matter. This is a productive environment scenario, obviously not a rangeland scenario. So to me, that's an appropriate starting point. And again, we saw these this morning. I just want to hit them again. If we graze it aggressively and take it down to that 1 to 3 inch height, what we would call a phase 1 residual, so we have pushed it into a native carbohydrate state, and we're going to ask it to regrow from stored energy. We already talked about that being bad for the plants, bad for the soil, bad for the livestock. We can leave it taller, more leaf area, keep the soil cooler, and good for the plants, good for the soil, good for the livestock. This is one of those silly rules of thumb that I came up with quite some time ago. It's called eyes to nostrils. And here we have, a cow out here, head down grazing, and we can see her nostrils. Every time she's taking a bite, we see the nostrils flare. If you can see a cow's nostrils when she's grazing, you can pretty well count on intake as being restricted by size of bite. She just cannot eat enough in that situation to meet the intake needs. Now here we have one, she's heading down grazing and we cannot see her eyes. And probably in this situation here, her intake is being limited not by availability, but by the quality of the forage. We have forage at a mature enough stage here that it is the amount of time she needs to ruminate. It's the reduction in rate of passage that is limiting intake. But if she's head down grazing, you can't see her nostrils, but you can see her eyes. That's kind of the sweet zone. And this, I don't remember who asked about the mid grasses, but here's the answer. What I would put on intake, whether we're talking about, cool season grasses, mid grass prairie, tall grass prairie. Basically, when a bovine is grazing, you don't want to see the nostrils, you do want to see the eyes. And that's kind of the sweet spot for optimizing intake. Increasing biting rate won't make up for small bite size. Okay, so we've talked about the intake side of nutrition. Now we're going to talk about nutrient density. And this is what is in that bite that she's taking. And we talk about energy, protein, minerals already, but then there's also the vitamins, enzymes, and other factors of nutrition that are in there. Tastes great, more filling, that's what we want. And so when we think about factors that affect forage quality, I already said that maturity, plant maturity is the number one determinant of forage quality. And it's one of the things that we can most effectively manage for. So this is, again, on the irrigated pasture, and on the right side of the fence, we have the whole season's growth out there. And this picture was taken about the 1st of August. And our big pivot is 300 acres. And in this particular year, I had 120 acres of that pivot that I did not get to with grazing. I can make bad mistakes and bad choices, just like anybody else can. And in this particular year, I made some ineffective planning and made some bad choices. And so I ended up 120 acres out of 300. That is 1st of August, and we have not taken a bite off of yet. Now, at this location, we do not have haymaking as a tool that we would use to, we can just roll it up in hay and restart that with fresh, high quality growth. And if you wonder why we don't make hay there, it's simply called rocks. Rocks. There's way too many rocks to make hay here. They used to make hay on these pivots. Well, this one, we had a 150 acre pivot and a 300 acre pivot. The 150 acre pivot had been there when I left the ranch 32 years, and had never been cut for hay because from the day it was seeded, there were too many rocks in it. And then the 300 acre pivot, when we first moved onto the ranch, they were cutting the entire thing for hay once a year. And then they reduced the portion that was, being made for hay. And then 2009 was the last year that any hay was made there. And the overall ranch manager, vowed at that time that he was never bringing hay equipment to Patterson again because just all the damage that was done. So this was later than 2009. So making it into hay was not an option. Because that's the full season's growth, August 1st, it says maintenance quality feed. You know what? It was still decent, late lactation feed for cow-calf pairs. It was okay. We did graze off that 120 acres between the 1st of August and the 12th of September when we weaned calves. And I had that year 500 pairs, 496. I had 496 pairs. It's easy to say 500. I had 496 pairs, and we just ground through it. I allocated, I said there was 120 acres. So I was given 496 pairs, 3 acres a day, and they mowed it down. But it cost us a little over 40 pounds in calf weaning weight. That 40 days of grazing that quality of forage with pairs, we came to the weaning pen a little over 40 pounds lighter than what we typically did. So there was a cost to it. That's what low quality feed gets you, is low performance. To the other side, it says finishing or dairy quality feed. That had been grazed probably twice already. Would have been grazed end of May, 1st of June, and then it was, no, I bet it was grazed just once. I can't remember. But anyway, you can see it's probably regrown about a month. And it's high quality feed. We could finish beef animals on that. It could be dairy feed. And it's the exact same pasture composition, right? It's just a difference in maturity. The typical cool season grass, from the time that it reaches boot stage, so that's just before the seed head pops out, from boot stage on, it'll lose digestibility at about 1.5% per day. So in 2 weeks' time, it's going to drop about 7% in digestibility, which means it would move us out of very high quality feed into high quality feed in that 2 weeks' time, or from high quality feed into medium quality feed, in 2 weeks' time. That's how fast it can change. On the non-native warm season grasses, things like Bermuda grass, Klein grass, star grass, they decline in digestible energy at a faster rate than what the cool season grasses do from the time, a head emerges. They might lose 2/3 of a percent digestibility per day. The native tall grasses, because of their growth habit, do not decline at as fast a rate as what the cool seasons do. So they might be at, 0.35, 0.4% per day. But every grass species does decline in digestibility once a seed head begins to form. That is just across the board. Legumes as they flower, if it is what we call a determinate legume, so think about alfalfa. You know, we have an alfalfa plant and basically all the stems bloom at once and they're all on the same life cycle. So on a determinate legume, forage digestibility declines fairly quickly as it goes from maturity or to maturity. In terms of protein content, the decline is not near as fast as the loss of digestibility. Then we have things that are non-determinate legumes, which means you can have vegetative stems, stems that bud, stems that flowering, and stems that have mature seed, all on the same plant simultaneously. Bird's foot trefoil is a good illustration of this. Some of your vetches are that way. Some clovers are determinate, some are indeterminate, but everything, as it moves towards maturity, forage value is going down. We can do broad categorizations like this and say, in general, at comparable stages of maturity, legumes are higher quality than grasses. Annuals are higher quality than perennials. Cool season forages are higher than warm season forages at comparable stages of maturity. Now, we can pick and choose individual species out of any of these categories, you know, and show, well, that isn't true all the time, but most of the time, this is how they sort out. Now, there I just have a general term of quality. I want to look at it now as energy and protein separately. So on an energy level, annuals at comparable stages of maturity, annuals are almost always going to be higher in energy than our perennials. Legumes are going to be higher in energy than grasses. Cool season grasses and warm season grasses at comparable stages of maturity basically have equivalent amounts of energy. But then we would take those warm season grasses out and say native warm season species. They're very comparable to our introduced cool season grasses. The introduced subtropical warm season grasses basically always have less energy than what a cool season forage would. So at proper stages of appropriate grazing stages, warm season grasses, we get very, very good performance out of them from an energy standpoint. We don't have a problem until proteins start to decline in it. So from a protein standpoint, in general, comparable stage of maturity, annuals are higher protein than perennials. This is why some people get so much better performance out of cover crops than they do out of their perennial pastures. It's because they're higher in both energy and protein. Legumes will always have more protein than grasses. And at comparable stages of maturity, this is absolutely true. But we have a lot of legumes that in a mature stage are going to have more protein than what an immature warm season grass might have. And then cool season perennial grasses, higher protein than warm season perennial grasses. There is a window of time when our native warm season grasses are very, very good feed and we can get very good yearling performance out of them. But basically, and it depends on exactly where you are here, I'm going to guess it's maybe August 20th, plus or minus. You'll be clicking along doing real well on yearling performance on native grasses, and then you get to that kind of mid-August point and they go down very quickly then. Maybe it's a little earlier here, maybe it's a little later, I'm not sure. But it does happen. And that is because you've crossed that line where there's no longer adequate protein in that warm season grass. Bringing a protein supplement out to those animals while they're grazing on that warm season grass, even after that mid-August break point or whenever it is, and you can pull performance back up. But that is when we do get into a very obvious protein issue in the native grasses, is when we hit that point mid to late summer when just suddenly the performance falls off very quickly. And then plant part, I think everybody recognizes that leaves are higher quality than stems. Not quite as recognizable is that the first bite that the animals take out of a pasture has more nutrient density than the next one. This one just illustrates it that way. But this is what we're really looking at. If we do a field school, one of the things that we have people do is simulate grazing. And we have them take their first bite, and then from the same area, take a second bite, and it illustrates that concept that the first wave of grazing that animals put across a field is where they have their highest intake and you can expect the best performance. This one just illustrates, over here we have crude protein, this is TDN. The top part of the plant is more nutrient dense than the bottom part of the plant. And so the less utilization we ask them to take, the higher the nutrient density of the bite is going to be. The deeper we ask them to graze into that canopy, the lower the nutrient density is going to be. And so that brings us to this point of quality pasture is where you create it. There's almost every plant community at some point in the season is an opportunity to be high quality nutritionally and can provide your livestock with a high level of performance. It's up to you to put the management strategies in place to ensure that you capture that quality when you need it with the livestock.